Hey guys, welcome back to Archangel Ministries. I'm glad you guys could actually join us today. It's my pleasure and my enjoyment to actually have Dr. Judd Burton on. I caught him on with Kenny Say on the Blurry Creatures podcast, and a couple of you guys recommended I start checking him out a few months ago, and he has been gracious enough to come on and join us in this discussion about end time prophecy and the creatures and stuff that we are going to begin to see increase in sightings and their relevance to biblical context and biblical history, and what we can what we can expect to see in the next coming weeks, months, whatever God's timeline might be. Dr. Burton, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of give people a brief overview of your works and what you're involved in?
Sure. Well, I'm Dr. Judd Burton. I'm primarily a historian of early Christianity and Greco-Roman antiquity, but I also have a master's degree in anthropology. So I wear that, there are two pairs of shoes, professional shoes that I wear, and you could add a third of those with the archaeological training that I've had. My PhD is from Texas Tech University, master's degree from the same institution. And I have for the longest time been interested in the human past. I mean, I've always been a history buff, largely because of my grandmother and my father. Because those kinds of reading materials were always around, and my grandmother was a librarian, so she had a host of books about the human past. And I became enamored with looking at the human past through the biblical lens at an early age, because I was raised in the church, and the two made a good pairing. And I was fortunate enough to have some good mentors like the late Dr. George Knight take me under their wing, and really at a young age, at like 10, start teaching me the rudiments of the study of biblical antiquities and history and field archaeology, so that I had a real sense of that world, even before I knew who Indiana Jones was, really. Yeah, in a nutshell, that's really what I do. I've meld historical and anthropological approaches to some of these biblical problems now, biblical questions, I should say, like those about the giants and all these kind of chimerical mythological things that show up in the Bible too, that we might collectively call monsters.
Well, I completely understand it. And we live in a time now where, if you actually do the research and pay attention to what's going on around you, the existence of these creatures can't be denied any further. I mean, never mind someone with a past like mine that was enthralled and thrust into a world that was surrounded by these things. But we've had sightings of dogmen, lichens alike. Where there have been reports of vampirism that have gone through the police departments, especially over in Russia and that area. We've had all kinds of sightings of giants and stuff dealing with our own military. One of my buddies was actually special forces, and he was on base when one of the incidents happened over in Iraq at the beginning of the war. And that first platoon went missing. He was actually on base for that when they brought in the corpse of the giant and everything else. He won't go public about it, but I get it. It's okay. I'm sure he's still under some sort of top secret agreements with the government and everything.
That's still pretty fresh, pretty recent.
Oh yeah, most definitely. But all throughout Scripture, we see references, especially if you go into the Septuagint rather than your King James or anything else, that talks about creatures such as Lilith or the basilisk, or specific types of giants, the lion men of Moab. And there's even references to giants and other beings that had teeth that were described as razors or like daggers. And we see all of this stuff strewn out all through biblical history. And then at a certain point, the church just decided, you know what, we're not going to pay attention to this anymore. And unfortunately, it's left the current church in a state of disillusionment,
Hmm.
of normalcy bias, where they refuse to acknowledge or accept that these things exist, even though the cases pop up around us all the time. I believe it was the late 90s. There was a family up in Maine who, if you believe their reports, had stumbled across a den and were later stalked and attacked that night by a pack of either lichens or dogmen.
Hmm.
And we've even got reports right now, never mind the stuff that my family deals with, over by where the Bell Witch scenario and stuff took place in
Sure.
Tennessee, of
Sure.
sightings of lichens or dogmen in that area.
Hmm. Yeah, clearly. Well, it's easy for people to deny because of what it basically comes down to is a confusion about statistics and statistical anomalies. The classical axiom is that correlation is not causation. But that doesn't mean that that when you apply the theological lens to this, that you can't find the causation. To me, the causation essentially goes back to the pre-flood world. The roots of these physical manifestations are demonic, if we're to believe apocryphal sources like Enoch. And Montague Summers, who wrote The Vampires Kith and Kin, actually was the first scholar that I ever saw make this connection between the pre-flood world and the vampire specifically. And there it is, and I think 1 Enoch, about chapter 14 or 15, with the judgment that's passed down upon the giants, the Nephilim, that their spirits are to be these wandering, hungering, thirsting, never sated spirits, always seeking to either corrupt or indwell human flesh. And this is right out of the playbook of the Nephilim while they were in corporeal form. Um, you know, Gobbling up humanity's resources, actually eating flesh and drinking blood. All of these kinds of characteristics, at least with the vampire, can be traced back to that pre-flood world, as I've made the case with other of these kinds of creatures do as well. But the point that I'm making is that over space and time, if you look at, you're just looking at this stuff in terms of mythology and folklore and the accounts that people give. Um, it only takes not even a handful. It just takes one of those accounts being true to kind of throw open the floodgates on that particular paradigm. And I would argue that just, law of averages, that more of those accounts are accurate, or at least are expressive of real experiences that people had with these entities, and they were preserved mostly in oral culture, but eventually in written culture as well. Um, and what's also interesting about it is just in terms of the cataloging of these kinds of events that people have with werewolves and vampires and ghouls and revenants and all kinds of chimerical creatures, is that once you get to the scientific revolution and really the enlightenment period of the 18th century, when the observational toolkit is swinging more towards the empirical rather than leaning on the biblical for its foundations. Not that empiricism doesn't have some value. I think about to demonstrate some of it. The great irony is that most of the accounts that end up in writing that we have about these encounters uh, stem from the training and education that people get during the so-called Enlightenment period. Because who is it that's making these reports? Well, they're army officers and magistrates and um, attorneys and army surgeons, people that are highly educated, highly trained. Um, and here they are preserving these accounts that that seem to twist the materialistic, naturalistic norm. Um, and that's kind of one of the dangers, pitfalls for the churches today, is that we've let so much materialism and naturalism creep into our seminaries that it's not just coming from pop culture anymore, it's coming from the pulpit.
Well, and that's always been one of the things that I found fascinating, because even if you go into just like the stories of the saints via Catholic dogma, you know,
Hmm.
uh, if you follow like the tale of Saint Christopher would be a prime
Hmm.
example, right?
Hmm.
You find stories that are just unfathomable.
Hmm.
I'm wanting to say it was either Saint Patrick or Saint Christopher that actually rescued a man from what would be referred to now as the Loch Ness monster.
Hmm.
Saint Christopher, if you go by the stories of the way that he helped people, especially the one where the river was flooded, where he would actually wade across the flooded river and actually carry people and their supplies and their carts and stuff from one side to another. This suggests that he himself could have possibly been, part Raphaim,
Hmm.
so to speak. And if that's the case, then it would also explain the reason why the Catholic Church and the Vatican has done so much to try and damage the historical evidence that they've uncovered over the centuries and generations and bury it from the eyes of the public, which has left the church in a state of them referring to these things as either just mundane or just exaggeration, because they want to adhere to Occam's razor and just say the simplest explanation is often the truth, rather than accepting the fact that these are supernatural events.
Which is really an irony, because if you're applying Occam's razor to the problem, um, then the simplest answer staring you in the face is the supernatural explanation.
Well, and that's the way that I've always viewed it. And I've lived a life where I've had to deal and been face to face with some of these entities that people want to deny their existence.
Hmm.
There were rituals and stuff that I was being put through for programming and initiation, where
Hmm.
these entities would show up and they would be in physical form.
Hmm.
One of them, these three entities, or they appeared to be three separate entities, but they were actually one. And the best way I could relate to the public what they were is, you see this in Greek mythology, you see this in Roman mythology, and you also see this in Viking and Nordic mythology, where in Greek they're referred to as the Fates.
Hmm.
And the Druidic texts are referred to as the Ladies of the Wood or the Donan. And these three entities loathe, humanity. They despise
Hmm.
it, and they were exceptionally vicious towards the other children and stuff that were there during these
Hmm.
rituals. And these were not human at
Hmm.
all. They
Hmm.
had the ability to manifest a physical presence, but they also had the ability to shapeshift and even go back
Hmm.
into the spiritual realm at will.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that seems to be I mean, we can apply whatever appellation we want to that, magical or technological. There's really not if you're looking at that sort of thing through the anthropological lens, then they learn where did they learn that from? Well, they learned it from the Watchers, who were their forebears.
Yeah.
They learned how to manipulate matter in this dimension, to use the quantum parlance of our day. Um, and it's the same sort of thing that allows angels to look anthropomorphic when they show up in the Old Testament. um, but they're being that those abilities are being used for two diametrically opposed purposes, if ever there were. um, but yeah, I if this was somebody's thesis project or dissertation project, um, in anthropology, it would fall under um, the methodological trajectory of ethnography. In other words, you're building a culture sketch of a particular society or particular subculture within a given space and time. It's what Clifford Geertz called thick description. You're basically writing about every cultural institution that you could find within this particular subgroup. Now, if academic freedom were really such a thing, and myself having been an academic for 20 years, I can tell you it's completely disappears. Um, if it were a real thing, then these would be legitimate and groundbreaking studies. So perhaps some of the most pertinent humanities studies uh, in the history of those disciplines, um, because of the things that are happening on the earth right now. And as you pointed out, the prophetic clock is really kind of ticking at this point. It has been for quite some time, but
Yeah.
we're starting to see more and more, come to pass that lines up with prophetic scripture. Um, but that's part of, at least on the scholarly end, it's why a number of us have turned to um, engaging people like yourself in these questions, because mainstream academia, which you would think would be a vehicle, a medium for thoroughly fleshing out some of these ideas, um, it's really not. It's not that they're. It goes beyond them not willing to have the conversation. They just they can't be bothered by it because they've been so indoctrinated with materialism and naturalism that the supernatural elements of such cultural studies uh, are only valuable as a sort of cultural commodity, which always made me ask questions about, well, we tend to think that we've come so far from, let's just say in museology, um, museum science, we've come so far, and we think that we've come so far with things like cultural resource management and not exploiting other countries' antiquities or what have you. But have we really, when we try to demystify um, and take the supernatural elements out of these cultures, it's really a different kind of commodification of culture. And if these stories, from the military that I've been hearing for the last decade are true, ring true, and I think that they do, um, then we're still exploiting other cultures for their antiquities, some dangerous antiquities, um, specifically for their supernatural properties.
Well, and we are, because the governments have an obsession with ancient fallen angel technology, what was left during the Antediluvian period, left over post flood. And
Hmm.
even in the scripture, we see post flood, we see these things come about. I mean, if you look at the case of Babylon and, Nimrod and stuff like that, and
Hmm.
he became a mighty man,
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
Ibrahim. Uh, if you go into like the Luciferian doctrines and things that I was inclined to and brought up with, then
Hmm.
there are so many cases where you don't get the full story from scripture. Now, I understand that Lucifer is a liar. He always has been, he always will be.
Hmm.
So you kind of have to take some of the stories and stuff with a grain of salt.
Hmm.
However, if you go into the text and stuff, you find that, you know, the descendant of Noah, he discovered a tablet that had been left behind by the Watchers and used the Rosetta Stone to translate it. And that is how he became a mighty man. He
You're
was
you're talking
able to,
about Canaan?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And he was able to go through the transformation because he was able to decipher the text and
Hmm.
things from the Antediluvian period. And it's just like if you go into the subject of vampirism, right? We see that there were different clans and stuff of the giants that had different traits. And we find this discussed in Enoch, and we even find some of it discussed in the Old Testament.
Hmm.
But according to vampiric lore that's contained within the realms of the Luciferians, within the realms of the Satanists, they claim that the first actual vampire post flood was actually Cain, and that it was Lilith that turned him.
Hmm.
Now, whether
That's
or not
interesting.
that's, yeah, whether or not that's verifiable, I can't vouch for, but that is what the legends and the texts that you were given inside the covens showed and taught.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's, I mean, that certainly lines up with ancient Jewish thought. I mean, clearly, as I've made the case before, it just it's always a great conversation starter. Hey, do you know vampires are in the Bible? What? Vampires? Like Count Dracula? I'm like, no. That's part of the challenge too, is stripping the cinematic and theatrical veneer of the vampire away and getting people to actually look at this in terms of biblical demonology,
Yes.
and realize that the Lilith, the Lilitu, the Lilith was something that ancient Jews were abundantly familiar with. Um, and it's written, the big passage is the Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, but she shows up in some other places like in the Psalms too. Um,
If I'm not mistaken, if you go to the Septuagint, is she not mentioned in Psalms 91?
that's right. Yeah. Psalms 91. And the Septuagint is really handy for doing stuff like that. I always encourage people to walk, rather than going immediately to the Masoretic stuff, which is later. It's Hebrew, but it's later. It's almost like Dark Age medieval, copies of copies of copies kind of stuff. If you go back and walk things through the Septuagint, you got a group of people here who were abundantly familiar not only with their native Hebrew religious traditions, but also those traditions of the Hellenistic world, the Greek world. So they were in a unique position to match those Hebrew idioms up as closely as they could with Greek idioms. And that's one of the values, I think, of the Septuagint, for modern students of the Bible.
Well, and I can't really imagine a better group of people that could do that because the Greek culture was so steeped in, the gods and
Mm,
the chimeric
hmm.
creatures that were created, and they went into the Titans and Tartarus and all of these other legends that if you go into Greek, what they refer to as mythology, and then you look at the sculptures and the pottery and everything else, you find that the demigods are always portrayed as being so much larger in stature compared to your average man,
Right.
which leans credibility to the Old Testament and the talks of, the giants and the titans and everything else.
Sure. Well, the Greeks themselves, the Greeks believe that a lot of their gods actually came from the East, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's the case. That is the ancient Oriental influence that let's say Mesopotamia and the Levant and Egypt and Turkey, Anatolia, also had on that. It had this influence within the realm of myth and literature on Greek culture, and this is demonstrable in a number of periods in Greek history. One during the Mycenaean period, although it continued, it ebbed and flowed, but there were two zeniths, you might call them, one in the Mycenaean period and then one in the Archaic period. And scholars call these periods Orientalizing periods because of the trade that the Greek world was receiving from the Levant. Um, they were constantly going back and forth on those eastern Mediterranean shipping lanes. And in the Archaic period, you start to see more, like cherubim and sphinxes and winged bulls and things like that on Corinthian and Athenian redware. Um, but there are actually some really good sources that make a very good case for um, the Eastern origin of Greek gods and Greek religion. Um, the East Face of the Helicon is a book that comes to mind off the top of my head. But in my own dissertation, which was on the religious history of Paneas or Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament, I made the argument that the goat god motif actually comes from the Levant and was transported to um, the other parts of the Greek world in later centuries. But I take that all the way, not just to Pan, but all the way back to Azazel, and of course the other kinds of goat gods like Amaru and Adzaga and Benu, and there are a host of them that were worshipped by the Amorites and the Akkadians and some of the other Mesopotamians, and of course the Shedim, the satyrs in Hebrew lore, which are also mentioned in conjunction with Lilith in Isaiah chapter 34. So it's very clear that the Greeks believed that many of their gods came from the East.
Well, and this makes perfect sense. I mean, even if you go into some of the more modern historical references, like say the writings of Marco Polo,
Hmm.
come to mind, where he described his time spent in the Orient,
Hmm.
and he gives actual descriptions of dragons being physical beings that interacted with humans on
Hmm.
a daily basis. Uh, once you start to break this down and you go from his writings to some of the writings and fables and stuff you find during that were written during the Middle Ages of knights challenging dragons and all of this
Hmm.
stuff, you find a clear delineation of personality types per individual type creature.
Hmm.
And we even see this in some of the modern sightings and stuff today. I mean, I think the goat man would be a prime example of that, because
Right.
you have some sightings where it seemed to behave very intelligently and have this yearning to try and communicate with the person that was there. And then you have other sightings and stuff where it was just a brute, vicious beast intent
Hmm.
on nothing but bloodlust and causing harm.
Right.
And I believe, personally, I believe because that this is happening because there is more than one.
Hmm.
So you're not encountering the same creature every time, but different ones, and therefore
Right.
you have different personality types.
Exactly. Yeah, and the fact that just from a genetic sciences standpoint, we've been making human animal chimera in this country, and probably in most of the developed industrial nations in the world that had the money to do it, have probably been making them for decades as well. Uh, which is kind of scary when you start lining that up with what was actually going on in the pre-flood world,
Yeah.
um, with what the Watchers were doing with not just human DNA, but all kinds of animal DNA.
Well, as it was in the days of Noah, correct?
Right.
I actually have a friend. They were SRA themselves,
Hmm.
although their story is a bit different from mine. Mine was done strictly at the hands of the covens and the Masons and the eclectic groups
Hmm.
like that. Theirs was more military oriented.
Hmm.
And he's recounted to me several times where he was taking down into the dumbs, the deep underground military bases,
Hmm.
and they would pass through the area where they were doing the gene splicing and genetic experiments. And he's told me of some of the creatures that were down there, uh, these chimeric entities that were a concoction of human DNA and that of a bear or a tiger or even goats and things of that nature. And he would describe to me how the abject misery that these creatures were in. They had this sense that they knew that they should not exist, yet they did. And all they
Hmm.
longed for was death, and they couldn't control the rage and violence that was inside of them.
Hmm.
And it was very heartbreaking to hear his testimony and him speaking about these subjects. And people don't understand that this stuff directly translates into pop culture. I
Hmm.
mean, where do people think that they got the ideas for the gene splicing experiments that you see in video games like Resident Evil from? Like the
Right.
first one, you had the creatures that, like the lickers and the hunters and stuff like that. And if you dig into the lore of the Resident Evil series, you find that the hunters were a splice between uh, reptilian and ape-like DNA, and that they were genetically modified and created in the video game series and the book franchise to be hunters that would neutralize and destroy anything that was infected by the virus or any humans if they quote unquote escaped.
Hmm.
So there's a clear line that connects the two, but most people don't understand it because they've never delved into the history of the gene splicing experiments or what the Nazis were involved in and how it bled into American politics and military complex after Operation Paperclip and all of this stuff. And it's this massive spider's web of
Hmm.
one point connected to the other. But even those points that are modern can still be traced back to the Old Testament and the fallen ones.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I think if more people had an appreciation for, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, is if more people could plug these points into world history, they'd see just how pertinent and timely this material is, and I mean, I'm sorry, but you can't get through a reading of the Bible without running into this stuff, and most of the time it gets swept under the church rug. I'm sad to say. I mean, it's been that way for decades from my experience, but um my buddy Mike Heiser says if it's weird and it's in the Bible, then it's probably important.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I look at it too.
Yeah.
And there's so much that is going on now that the people are just completely unaware of. I mean,
Hmm.
I've got surveillance videos from military posts across the world that were hit and attacked by entities that they have no description for, and at best could be described as chimeric, you know? And there's stories that go well beyond the mainstream populace or pop culture that are rooted in actual events that have happened, even on military bases or outposts in the middle of the desert somewhere.
Hmm.
And I've heard from several former military people that described the reports and stuff they read through. Another friend of mine was a former MP in the military, and one of his main jobs was disposing of classified files. And
Hmm.
he's told me on multiple occasions, Jason, you would never believe the type of stuff I've handled and what I've read into.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Yeah. That yeah, the amount of, I mean, it's great that we have things like the Freedom of Information Act where we can get to that, but a lot of the stuff that we get back is so redacted.
Oh yeah.
it, it's something is there, but it's hard to put a cohesive picture together. And yeah, I'm sure you feel the same way. What I wouldn't give to see some of those documents, just completely unredacted.
You got that right. I would
Hmm.
love to get a hold of those and, scream it from the mountaintops if I could.
Yeah, yeah. But even then, there are going to be people that won't believe you. I
Well,
mean,
and I've accepted over the years, because I mean, my testimony is not your average one. Neither is any other person that's endured satanic ritual abuse and been
certainly.
exposed to that world. So once you get to a certain point of healing, you stop fighting the current and you realize that those whom God has called, who has eyes to see and ears to hear, will listen
Mhm.
and understand and see truth in what's being spoken and talked about, and those who don't simply will not.
Yeah.
uh, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring you on, because there's so much stuff going on now, and there's so many pieces that are in play in this 5D chess game that's going, that the church really needs to be prepared. They really need to
Mhm.
know that with everything that's going on, yes, what's happening in Canada is terrible. Australia, terrible. Norway and Germany, Ukraine, Russia. Yes, these are very bad things, and it's all part of the Luciferian plans. We know this. All right. But my concern is not so much with that, because that is humans and that is of a physical nature.
Mhm.
These things can be dealt with either directly by God, or if you train hard enough, if you have to defend the lives of you and your family, it can be dealt with God on your side.
Mhm.
Uh, But once it gets to a certain point, what I was brought up in, what I was told, and what my alters who have gradually been healed one at a time have spoken to me and revealed to me, what they were told and informed of, is there's going to be a time where not only the chosen ones that are still under the Luciferian programming are going to be activated, but you're also going to see the lichens come into play, the vampires, dogmen, things like that, because there are entire sets of them that are simply awaiting orders. There's been several cases that I've been reading into and studying up on that have happened in California and the mountains of Colorado and some of the state parks over the last few years, that of pastors and their families. Official report says they were mauled by bears or a cougar or something like that. But after looking into it, this is the unmistakable mark of a satanic assassin being sent after them. And I would be willing to bet dollars to pesos that this has traces of werewolves and lycanthropy all over it. Because
yeah, I don't see why not.
Yeah. Well, in that world, what people really have to grasp and understand is in the Luciferian world, you have entire sects of vampires. You have entire clans. You have entire sets of lichens, entire clans of that. And I really try and do my best to get people out of the Hollywood type mentality.
Yeah.
You know, if a vampire bites you, you're not turning into a vampire. That's folklore and myth, and it's nonsense. It's Hollywood putrefaction. There's a specific rite of passage and ritualization you have to go through in order for a spirit, a demon of vampirism, to come into you and actually take hold and transform you on a physical basis. It's the same thing with lycanthropy. And people don't understand that in the realms of the Luciferians, these entities, these people that are possessed by these creatures, serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that is assassination.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult challenge, is getting people to look past the cinematic and pop culture iterations of these entities. And they've been very clever about how they presented them. You know, they've turned them into heroes and you know, things to be lauded and sought after. They've turned vampires and werewolves sexy, in other words.
Yeah.
And that's just not the truth. It's grounded in reality. Yeah, it's a dangerous thing to become reliant on pop culture. You know, just like anything else, if you're just taking everything in passively, like the news, if you're just taking everything in passively and not ferreting it out for yourself, then you're going to run into a lot of these pitfalls. And the same goes for these kinds of these entities that show up, if not in the Old Testament, then in the same world contextual backdrop that the Old Testament and New Testament, for that matter, were written in. Like I say, these experiences are reflective of these stories are reflective of experiences that people had in real space and time, you know, to one degree or another. And because it's a facet of demonology, the church should be actively engaged in that conversation, not just engaged in it, but training a whole new generation of pastors who are going to have to deal with this stuff up front, up close and personal, you know, in the decades to come. You know, failing a great awakening of 18th century proportions, I'm not sure that we'll see that. You know, God willing, we will, but we can't.
Well, and
we can't know that.
Well, and that's true, but it's also one of those things that, you know, it's just like God told me a long time ago that when my job as a watchman was over, that my job be to feed and protect his people. And I know that this includes giving his people knowledge, you know, because whatever happens, whether World War III starts, whether it doesn't, it doesn't really matter to me at this point. simply because we're entering a new phase of the Luciferians where they are very public about what they do, and they've become very bold and very
Mm-hmm.
belligerent in their actions. And the more they continue to do this, this only leads one path. This only leads one direction. And the church owes it to themselves, especially those that are called by God, because let's face it, your mainstream church is never going to even consider these things. But those that are called to be his remnant, those that are called to be his own, that he keeps close to him under his wings, need to have a good understanding of these entities, these creatures. They need to
Mm-hmm.
have a firm grasp on biblical demonology, fallen
Mm-hmm.
angels. They need to have a firm grasp on the chimeric entities like dogmen or goatman or
Mm-hmm.
any of these other creatures, and be able to stand against them and understand that the authority that Christ gave you was not only to cast out demons, but it was over all the weapons and powers of the enemy, these creatures included.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you've practiced spiritual warfare on a regular basis and are adept at it, and no longer can be overcome by that demonic aura of fear that they promote, then you're not going to be able to stand and look at one of these creatures in the face and know your authority over it.
Mm-hmm. That's very true.
So it's one of those things. It's a daunting task, but I believe with people like yourself and Brother Greg and the work you guys have been doing on, the Blurry Creatures podcast and everything else, it's a step in the right direction. It really is, because I can tell people of my testimony all day long, but unless I have someone that has the historical context and the authority to teach on these things like yourself, to be able to show these people, look, this is talked about here, 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 and here. This is historical context here, 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 and here. It's very hard to bring people out of the shadows of ignorance and into God's knowledge and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, to a certain degree, we're dependent on the Holy Spirit to do that, but we also have our role to draw all people to Christ through our example, and that includes sharing this kind of information, um, because it's always, sometimes it's in your face during Jesus's ministry, but it's always just below the surface. I don't know that I would have. It's by the grace of God that I made the discoveries I have about Peneus and Mount Hermon, but I don't know that I would have had I stepped back and taken a purely contextual look at that world, specifically that episode in Jesus's ministry, um, understanding the history of the area that he chose to make those statements in, the statements that himself, that they used himself, the phraseology that he's using, the words that he's carefully constructing to make these points.
And
Ma-
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just saying, I listened to your presentation on that, and it was for me very enthralling, because you can't understand, the Goat Man and Azazel and these other entities, and really grasp, unless you have at least a basic understanding of these beings and entities. You
Hmm.
can't really grasp the significance of what Christ was doing there. Would you care to elaborate on it some, help educate some of the viewers?
Yeah, well, Derek Gilbert asked me one time if I could tell people why giants are understanding giants and fallen angels. Why is that important? I said two words: Caesarea Philippi. It's Jesus. Jesus's visit there is really the glue that holds that whole narrative together. Because what does he do? He goes there to publicly and solidly state his messiahship. He goes there to establish the organization that would carry on his mission, the church. And he does it in this backdrop against where the Genesis 6 experiment took place. The Watchers fell. Um, the Nephilim, the Chimera, it all starts there. He goes back to ground zero, where this corruptive, influence on mankind extends past. It's really the first major next step in the Luciferian coup, if you will, after he's kicked out of heaven. And so it's not, but it's not just the mountain. It's the fact that you have the remnants of Og of Bashan. You have his kingdom Bashan just right there to the east. The apostate tribe of Dan had land that was allotted to them just to the west across the valley from Caesarea Philippi. In effect, Jesus is firing a shot over the enemy's bow. He's putting the unseen on notice as well, and anybody within earshot of him, whether they had been Jews, the indigenous Etrurians who made up most of the citizenry at Caesarea Philippi, they would have been familiar with the stories. And I think this is something that I've uncovered lately. I'm working on a paper that argues that Jesus, now we know that they arrived there sometime in the winter before his death, but I was always curious as to whether we could pin that down a little more accurately. And it dawned on me that if he's firing a shot over the bow, like I've been arguing in papers and books for years, is that it would make sense that he probably came there with his disciples during the time of the Lupercalia. Lupercalia takes place on February the 15th on the Roman calendar and is a festival that honors the god Pan. Well, it would make sense. You're in the city of Pan. We already know from other sources, inscriptions and things that the priests leave from us, and the votive offerings at the cave, all that kind of stuff. We know that the Lupercalia was a big thing at Caesarea Philippi, Paneas, as it would be. I mean, the main feature in the Temenos there is the temple to Pan, the big yawning cave that's such a huge feature of the site. And so I argue that Jesus, is an added layer of meaning here, because he's really kind of drumming Azazel's nose, or Pan's nose, however you want to look at it. It's the good shepherd versus the God of the shepherds, essentially taking place. And it, to my mind, this whole episode was so carefully thought out by Jesus that I think that the timing would have been well crafted as well. And that's why I think that the likely timing, more exact timing for their arrival, was the Lupercalia.
I could definitely see that. I mean, if you follow Christ, his lifespan and his ministry and everything else, you see very clearly that he came not only as the perfect lamb to absolve us of sin and to be the perfect sacrifice, but he came to be a direct confrontation to Lucifer and the fallen ones and the Watchers and all of those things. And this is one of those reasons why one of the mantles I've taken up is strictly against this Christian teaching of pacifism that has saturated the church over the years. Because if you follow Christ's ministry, he was anything but pacifistic when it came to the enemy. And just the event you're talking about, that's no different than walking up to a king of a region and slapping him in front of his entire army.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and it has, to a lesser degree, I mean, the greater degree, of course, being the Caesarea Philippi episode, but to a lesser degree, it would be like, what if churches across the nation had decided to storm this Satan Con thing that they had in where did they have it? I can't remember if it was in California or something, but it took place over 3 days in
I think.
Arizona. I think that's right. And I think the apex day was the Lupercalia.
Yeah.
It would be like us showing up there in mass, and protesting.
I wanted to, but my wife wouldn't let me.
Well, like I said, you want to keep the boss happy. So
That's all right. She only has my best interest at heart. She knows I am prone to be very aggressive
indignant.
at times. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no amount of respect for the adversary and those that they dupe. I'm not shy at all to walk up to them and tell them like, "You're an idiot.
Yeah.
You have no idea what you're involved in. You have no
Very good.
idea the ramifications and how deep this goes."
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't help it.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I understand. But yeah, it just seems that I don't think there's ever been a time in the church's history when it's been more relevant to know about these kinds of things, and we've been so busy guarding the vanguard of the church that the last few decades the devil has just kind of creeped into the back door, so that we end up with all this new age Christian woo woo basically that ends
Yeah.
up infecting our theology. um and we end up you know here we are, we've turned Jesus into a life coach and the church into morally therapeutic deism.
Yeah, it's nothing more than a self-help seminar run by someone that wants you to pay tithes.
Right. Right.
It's very concerning, the modern state of the church. And you know, I understand there are still some good pastors out there,
Yeah.
some good churches out there. I'm privileged to know a few.
Hmm.
Uh, but for the most part, the church has almost entirely fallen because they are obsessed with entertainment and self promotion
Hmm.
and everything but Christ.
Yeah.
They have no authority. If the Western church would have taught the scriptures in context, taught them appropriately, then Western civilization would not be where it is, and the Luciferians wouldn't be bold enough to even step outside their hidey hole.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true, I'm afraid. And I've noticed a lot, you know, I've noticed a lot of that, especially from the academic end on the influence of churches, particularly seminaries and colleges that are training ministers, they too were infected by postmodernism, that essentially destroyed objective truth, not only in higher education, but it's also done it in our public education system too. So that,
Well, and we see this all throughout academia. I mean, I know several people that are in scientists,
hmm
and their biggest thing is theory of intelligent design, but they
hmm
have been stomped out and completely silenced by those who adhere to Darwinism. And
yeah,
so you also see this not just in the scientific fields, but you also see this in history, you see this in modern educational structure. It's run rampant. I mean, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do?
hmm well, we jettison. I can speak to the educational end of this because I taught for over 2 decades. That we jettison the classical approaches, the classical paradigms. I'm not just strictly talking about like the Greco-Roman stuff. It is that, but that eventually became married to Christian theology. Um, that style of education, first with the shortly after the Irish were converted to Christianity, and then in Charlemagne's court under a monk named Alcuin, and that became the basis for Western Christian, education in the seven liberal arts, and that was the standard really until the middle of the 20th century. Um, and that's when we started kicking God out of the classroom and throwing prayer out of the classroom, and um, it's but it no, it's not just that. That's also when critical thinking and reasoning that was so much a part of the classical approach um, was also thrown out. It was gradually being eroded, And you cannot have you cannot have valid inquiry without objective truth. That's
Yeah.
just absurd. It sounds absurd that I should have to articulate that, but this is the
Well,
kind of nonsense that, and admittedly, it's rampant in the humanities.
yeah.
But it's all over, but it's rampant in the humanities. And it's really sad that I should even have to articulate that, but there it is.
Well, it's like the old adage, beware the sound of one hand clapping,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
which is a solid way of stating to someone, okay, if this side has an argument and they're making all the noise, this side has an argument too. Why aren't you listening to them? Why are they being forced to stay silent?
Hmm.
You know,
Indeed.
there's so much, and I'm very thankful to, teachers and doctors and stuff that are they're like yourself, that are bold enough to speak out and try and shake the people awake and say, hey, look, this stuff is real. We have all of these historical accounts throughout history that show all of this is real. We even have accounts of Christ's ministry where he challenges these entities directly to show his people that this stuff is real.
That's right.
And if you go through the Gospels and just the New Testament alone, you find references from the book of Enoch and Jubilees and things
Hmm.
like that scattered all throughout it, which means that the early church had an understanding that this stuff existed, this is real, and this is where Christ's authority is so important.
Hmm.
And if you can't grasp that these entities are real, that the chimeras that they created are real, that fallen angel technology is real, that the Andaluvian period has been all but swept under the rug, then how can you expect or even hope to exist in the time frame that we're in now and
Hmm.
understand the authority Christ gave you so you can walk in it in maturity?
Hmm. That's very true. And at the end of the day, the sad fact of the matter is that whether, I mean, it matters whether people believe in this stuff or not, but the existence of these things and the chain of causation and their reality is not dependent on your belief. They exist whether you believe in them or not,
Yeah.
which is kind of a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow.
Well,
Um,
and I get that a lot with my personal testimony, and I don't know anyone that survives satanic ritual abuse that doesn't get met with the same, questioning or doubt or stuff like
mhm,
that.
mhm.
Uh, there are people out there that refuse to accept the fact that there is a Luciferian cabal that operates in the shadows and manipulates almost everything that is around you.
Yeah.
They refuse to accept that. And I have to tell people all the time, let me be blunt with you. It doesn't matter what you believe, they believe it
Yeah.
and they know it. It is what it is.
Yeah.
There's no way to live in the society that we are in now and do what needs to be done and understand the time period we're living in unless you can go back to the Psalms, right? I mean, and the kings of the earth rise up against God, and right there,
Mhm.
it says it point blank. I mean, how can you deny, how can you claim to be Christian yet deny what scripture actually states as fact? It makes no
Mhm.
sense to me.
Well, that's sort of epiphenomenal of what's happened to the church, is that we're able to intellectually compartmentalize
Yeah.
a lot of that stuff. I mean, the cognitive dissonance that we see in other parts of our society has made its way into the church as well.
Oh, I've got a question for you. I'd love to get your opinion on it real quick.
Hmm.
Uh, all right. We're living in a time span now where the Luciferians in control of the entertainment industry are not the least bit shy about talking about these creatures and the genetic experiments and stuff like that. I mean, you had that movie Splice that came out years ago.
Hmm.
The movies on vampires and werewolves are almost innumerable at this point.
Hmm.
Then you had even the Lord of the Rings, with the creatures and stuff. And most people don't understand Tolkien's inspiration he got from biblical context for that.
Right.
But you also have these modern series that have come out, such as The Witcher, and I've read through all those novels, and I can cite there are facts and stuff that stem from Nordic and Druidic
Hmm.
teachings and stuff that are very, very heavily inlaid in that, including the creation of witchers. Because if you want to go bit by bit, then witchers were nothing more than some of the medieval versions of satanic ritually abused victims that the
Hmm.
druids and stuff used to track down and handle what they unleashed and their mistakes.
Hmm.
But you have all the monsters and stuff that are talked about in that, and a lot of them that are especially involved in The Witcher don't really match up to historical context,
Hmm.
especially like in the case of the basilisk and
Hmm.
things like that. But they're still bringing all this stuff to the front,
Hmm.
and I believe my instincts tell me that it is because we are going to see an increase in these sightings and these creatures showing up. And I was wondering, as a man of historical context, someone that has been in the muck and mire and dug through, anthropology and the ancient ruins and the texts and everything else. Have you come across anything similar to like what Russ Dizdar was working on before he passed away, where the stuff they were investigating, they came across some of the angelic glyphs that have been left behind by the covens that were orchestrating and talking about their plans, uh,
Hmm.
uh, and even biblical prophecy? What can you tell us that you possibly see that would arise up that the church will probably have to deal with in the next few years, do you think?
Well, I see a sort of meta picture. I relied heavily on people like Russ, for boots on, and Greg Reed too, for kind of boots on the ground information. And I would always walk what they were telling me through my training, the stuff that I was familiar with already. And um, we would always circle back to Jesus's warning in Matthew chapter, was it chapter 24, about the days of Noah. Jesus could have picked any passage from the Old Testament to talk about people being caught off guard, but he specifically, again, Jesus doesn't say anything by accident. He specifically um, chose this passage to illustrate um, what things would be like in the end times. And if you look at that, he's talking about the antediluvian world, and he's talking about it at perhaps its worst time, just in terms of the plight of humanity. And involved in that were, the Nephilim, the first generation of giants, and the chimera, not just the anthropomorphic giants, but the chimera Nephilim as well. So I think there's an indication there that that stuff is on the horizon, and it's just starting to kind of twitch the veil now, as it were, because we're seeing more cryptid sightings, if you will, per capita than we have in a long time. But same thing is true for UFO sightings and UFO encounters right now as well. So to me, it's all linked, and it's all I used to halfway joke with people that it hasn't gotten Lord of the Rings meets Terminator weird yet. Well, we're pretty
We're
close to that.
quickly approaching that.
We're fast approaching that precipice. Um, and I'm not trying to be hyperbolic or flippant about it. It's just there are certain realities uh, that people are going to have to get used to. Um, you know, Art Bell used to talk about it on Coast to Coast for years. He could never quite put his finger on it, but he called it the quickening. He knew, he could tell that there was something on the horizon, and it wasn't necessarily a good thing that was on the horizon either.
Yeah. Well, trying to figure out how to word my next question. uh, all right. Tips and tricks, I guess, would be the way that I would put it. You know,
Okay.
we find legends and stuff about lycanthropy and vampirism and stuff like that. And the mistake that people make is they rely on this folklore and these false tales, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, or even what was the name of that story out of I want to say it was France, about the werewolf, the silver bullet. I cannot remember the gentleman's name.
Not sure. There was a
Well, there was a tale of a werewolf attack that happened. I want to say outside of France.
Was this from Baring-Gould's book?
Possibly. Anyways, the story has it that man had some sort of crucifix or something that was made of pure silver, melted down, made a bullet out of it, and that's what was used to kill the werewolf that was killing the villagers and stuff in the area. Trying to remember the exact tale that was from. But anyways, it's because of tales like that and things of that nature that people have this very Hollywood-esque fictional conception of these creatures and how you kill them and all that stuff in their mind. You know, as someone whose generational spirit was one of vampirism, I can tell you that crosses and holy water don't do anything. Someone that's possessed by that particular type spirit can walk out in the sunlight. It's not exactly a pleasant stroll, but
nine times out of 10, those traditions, the dispatchments and apotropaics that survive in folklore, are reflective of a cultural reaction and not necessarily anything that's grounded in reality. That doesn't mean that there's not any merit to studying folklore. Obviously there is. And I would distinguish a lot of those tales. Just it's not that literature and film have not borrowed from them. It's just that they don't look at them longitudinally in broad scope, like a scholar would. So you have to kind of find the golden mean, in groups of them. You're going to find all kinds of variations on themes, the world over, depending on what kind of folklore that you encounter. And the same goes for mythology. It's still valuable as evidence and often contains historical nuggets. For the longest time we thought that Gilgamesh was just a literary device, literary hero, until we found his name on the Sumerian kings list.
Yeah.
The same goes for Homer's epics about the Trojan War. It was Frank Calvert and Heinrich Schliemann that excavated Hisarlik and found the city of Troy. So that dividing line between what we now rather easily lay mythology and folklore on one side and history on the other was not so clear the further back you go. And it really correlates with the emergence of writing.
Yeah.
Writing systems, especially if you go into like late prehistory and the Mesolithic, people, and really even in early antiquity, people are still thinking along those lines. That these are just stories that we tell. We're not calling them history or mythology. They're just our stories.
Yeah.
So, but you're right insofar as that. We're bombarded, with all this imagery and modern interpretations of vampirism and lycanthropy and witchcraft and all manner of demonic creatures. And the end goal, of course, is to normalize normalize all that so that we're not so um, unmanageable
Yeah.
when those things, come marching down our driveway.
Yeah. Well, it's all going to come full circle, so to speak.
Yeah.
The things of the past are going to reemerge, just as Scripture
Hmm.
states. There is no new thing under the sun.
Hmm.
Uh, could you? I said, I know your website. I picked up a couple of the ebooks that you had listed on there the
Hmm.
other day. I'm very
Hmm.
much enjoying the one that I believe was written by Gould.
Yeah, Baring Gold,
Is that
Sabine
right?
Baring Gold.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, on the lichens and werewolves.
Hmm.
Very, very interesting read. Uh, are there any other, texts and books? I definitely want to recommend at the end of this. I would very much like for you to give people information on how to take your course
Sure.
and stuff like that. But are
Hmm.
there any other texts and stuff that people could kind of investigate to find out these things? Like one of the things I've been looking to here lately is ancient Druidic, Nordic, and medieval time period bestiaries
Hmm.
to really get a grasp on the type of chimeric creatures and stuff they dealt with.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
are there any like really good, outstanding sources and stuff you can think of so that people can really dig into this a little bit more if they choose to?
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff out there that could get you started. In terms of vampires, I still point people to Montague Summers's work, um, "The Vampires Kith and Kin," which is actually a textbook for one of my courses, and he wrote a sequel to that called "The Vampire in Europe." Both of them are very good. He wrote a number of books on these subjects. He also wrote one on werewolves called "The Werewolf in Lore and Legend." And he wrote two really good books on witchcraft. The first is a history of witchcraft and demonology, and the other one is the geography of witchcraft. Um, a brilliant guy, English clergyman in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so there's a whole retinue of material that Summers put out, and it's just copiously cited. The bibliography usually makes up about a fifth of his books, each of his individual books. So he was a consummate scholar, spoke several different languages. So he's dealing with a lot of material from different parts of the world. Um, and In terms of chimera, there's so much out there because basically every culture has traditions of chimera. Half animal, half human. Um, Half animal, half human entities. Um, I would point people to what's the guy's name? Oh, I'm drawing a blank. Spence. No, it's not. It's not Lewis Spence. I'll think of it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Um, at any rate, yeah, in fact, you're really no more than a Google search away because there's so much text out there that's just in the public domain that can help you get your feet wet. Um, and not just beyond that, to really take some pretty deep dives into um, all of this material. Um, the Paul Karras although Paul Karras was not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, does a really good history of religions treatment of the devil. Um, Jeffrey Burton Russell's exhaustive study on the devil and witchcraft, I also highly recommend. I think there are like 6 or 7 books in that series, beginning with the study of biblical demonology and sort of moving forward through the historical periods. Um, but since I've done so much work on vampires, werewolves, and witches, and you often find that witchcraft is the glue that holds a lot of this stuff together. And from your background coming out of SRA, you can attest to the spellcraft that's involved in the actual transformation
Right.
into these entities, and it's something that turns up again and again in these stories, um, which I don't think gets brought out enough. Um, when you have for all their good intentions, a lot of people don't bring that up in accounts of vampirism and lycanthropy,
Yeah.
but it's very much there. I mean, use of hallucinogenic ointments and um, what the Bible would have called pharmakeia.
Yeah.
Um,
You see that even in context with the ancient Nordic
yes, the
traditions of
berserkers.
berserkers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is that it's in some of these cases it's very much to the fore. In others you really have to kind of dig for it. But like you say, I teach coursework on this. The program that deals with a lot of the material we've talked about today is preternatural morphology, which talks about how demons manifest within these cultural contexts and show up as, you know again, it's the demonic spirit that's at the root of all of these creatures, whether they're vampires or werewolves, or take your pick.
Yes, it
And
is.
that's really the hot button class right now. I would say that easily a third of the students I have right now are taking that program.
Well, and not if I can be so bold, I would very much love to have you come back on sometime where me and you can kind of hash that out and maybe do a program. I don't want you to give anything away that's in your classes, uh, but where we could kind of at least touch on the subjects and maybe some of the history and accounts that we see that support this.
Sure. Love to. Love to.
I would very much enjoy it, and I think that the church would very much benefit from it because I've always, there's been so many writings on warfare and stuff like that, but I
Hmm.
believe Sun Tzu put it best. Sun Tzu once stated that if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you need not fear defeat.
Yeah.
If you know only yourself and not your enemy, then you will succumb to half of your battles. But if you
Hmm.
know neither yourself nor your enemy, you will live in defeat.
Hmm.
And we're living in a time period now. I really want to try and do my part to help prepare the church and build up people so they have this knowledge, this understanding of the root cause of these issues and these creatures and stuff that they one day may face so that
Hmm.
they know how to deal with them the way that they're supposed to.
Right. Amen.
Man, it has been a blast having you on. I can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this program, man. It's been awesome. I think that once the video comes out, that people are going to learn a lot from just getting to listen to you. And uh, before we go, I really want you to, give them your website and some of the
Sure.
courses that you're offering, so these guys can go and hopefully you'll get a bunch of new students out of this.
Yeah. Sure. I've got 6 programs. The preternatural morphology is the big one, but I've got biblical anthropology, which is basically history and context, and I've got uh, biblical demonology, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then I also have a world mythology through the biblical lens course, and then the 2 other programs are ancient Near Eastern civilization and then Mediterranean civilization, looking at how these worlds are connected with the biblical world. Um, And the way that I describe it to people is it's like Sunday school meets the X-Files. I'm going to teach you all the stuff that they don't teach you, and that seminaries won't teach you. Um, so those will be on sale for a while for about $115 each, and it's really easy to sign up. Just shoot me an email at professorburton@yahoo.com, and we can get you registered. And websites are burtonbeyond.com, and the Institute website is tioba.org. And people can follow me on social media. I've got a YouTube channel and lots of ways to keep up with me.
That's awesome. And just so everybody knows, I'm also going to put the links to everything you just discussed down in the description. That way they can have quick, easy access. And
Excellent.
and thank you so much for coming on. And I'm thoroughly looking forward to us doing another round. Uh,
Absolutely.
and man, it's been great. So I hope you have a wonderful and blessed rest of your day. And I'm very looking forward to the next segment that you guys are supposed to be working on, I think tomorrow, for Blurry Creatures. Uh, if
I
if
don't
if I
soon, probably this week. Probably this
okay,
week.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know Kenny said something about you guys had something coming up soon. So
Oh well,
I,
Kenny and I are recording tomorrow.
okay, yeah. See,
Yeah.
that's what I thought. I didn't know if it was for Blurry Creatures or what exactly it was for, but
Yeah.
I always look forward to hearing you and everyone else, talk, because the information and the knowledge gained is very valuable, especially in light of the times we're living in. And so it's been a real blessing to know that there are others out there that can operate on that level and have these conversations in a rational, theological, historical type conduct. It's awesome.
Hmm.
I really enjoy it.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you, and you have a wonderful rest of your day, sir.
Okay, you too.
God
Godspeed.
bless.